Pam and Aleph, 88. Okay, and we are at just 1 second. It's about 8 lines down. Sort of right in the middle. So just a little bit of background. We were talking about the Mishnah gave an example of somebody who came into town claiming that a woman was his wife and the kids were her kids. And basically, if the kids are young children, and she's present, then we believe that they're her kids, because the presumption here, the chazaka, is that they should be her kids. And the Gemara says we see that chazaka, this presumption, is very powerful. How do we know? How powerful is it? If we have a family that lives together, we presume they're actually a family. And if there's incest going on, there's potential for capital punishment, even though we don't know for certain who the father is, who the mother is, etc. So you can get capital punishment because of chazaka, because of presumptive state. What's the source of this? Because Rabbi Barafuna, like Rabbi Barafuna, you have a man and a woman and 2 children, a boy and a girl, that grew up in the same house. If they have an ancestral relationship between them, then they will get potentially capital punishment. Rav Shimon says in the name of Bar Kapara, there's a story of a woman who came to Jerusalem, and she was carrying a kid on her shoulders, and she raised the kid on her shoulders, meaning the kid obviously was quite young. He needed to be carried, and she raises the kid, and then they have an ancestral relationship. They brought him to court, and they gave him capital punishment. Now, we had no way of knowing for certain if this was her son. Nobody's witnessed the birth. We just know that they were living together. They came into town, after he was already born. Because they sort of lived together, that's enough to create a presumption that the kid was her child. Okay, and the final caveat was an interesting one. The ain surf and truma ala chazaka. We will not burn truma because of a chazaka. Okay, so in other words, chazaka is powerful enough you can give somebody malchus, right? In other words, if a woman acts like a nida, like Gemara points out, she has certain clothes that she usually wears. Maybe her clothes were stained, and her neighbors happen to have seen it, and so now she's a presumptive nida, and her husband is intimate with her. We give malchus. Not only that, if we have a family who is presumptively related, because nobody actually was there for the childbirth, that suffices to give a capital punishment in the scenario of incest. However, as it pertains to burning truma, we do not follow these presumptions.
Really? Why are we burning the truma? If we're going to burn the truma, why?
Truma, because it became tummy.
Oh,
potentially. Whatever, we'll have to see. And I'll try to explain this. This is very similar to what we had yesterday. Okay, so if you go back to what we saw yesterday, same chazaka story. Over there, we were talking about. Give me a second. It was 2 days ago, actually. Hold on. Where was it? Yeah, so it was yesterday. Yesterday we were talking about chazaka dehashta versus chazaka demikara. In other words, her current presumptive state versus her past presumptive state. So in that scenario, the scenario was a woman who was a woman who's maturing, right? The last day of maturity. So do we consider her mature a whole day, or do we consider her mature at the last possible moment before she investigated whether or not she was mature? Now over there's no chazaka. There's no other, in other words, there's no other reason to presume. We know that she's going to mature. And that sort of creates a question, when did she mature that day? But truma, there's always going to be a second factor, which is the item itself. The item itself has a chazaka of being kosher. Just like the item that went to the mikveh that was tummy has a chazaka of being tummy. Its first status was tummy, and that isn't necessarily something that's going to change. So there's a little bit. It's a little bit different. So the chazaka of truma is not exactly. It's not exactly similar to the previous two scenarios. So let's see exactly what we're talking about.
80A, Rabbi?
80A, about halfway down the page.
First word.
Sarf and truma al chazaka. Orim Shimon Lakish, sarf and al chazakas. Rish Lakish says you do burn truma because of chazaka. For Rabbi Yochanan ain't sarfin, and Rabbi Yochanan says we don't. Va'azu tamaya. They go according to the each according to his own opinion. The time we learned. Tinik shenim tzavsada isa. So we have a dough and we have a kid. Now, obviously, as we know, kids play with bugs, and some of the bugs are part of the Shema and Shratzim, the 8 types of bugs that make things tabby. Now, bugs here is used in a very loose sense, not a defined sense. I'm using really the word shrotzim, and I'm loosely translating that as bugs. Some of the shrotzim are rodents, not what you might call insects. Okay, that's just a complete side point. Be that it is, the 8 shrotzim, 8 bugs. So the kids play with the bugs, right? Obviously, and there's no real way to know if a kid is tahar. Maybe he's been playing with bugs and he's actually tummy. So the rabbi said that all kids are tummy unless you're actually supervising them. And you could see that he wasn't playing with bugs. This is before the days of, you couldn't lock them in the room because the room was not exactly, it wasn't surfaced, right? There was no, the ground was earth and bugs, effectively.
No, that's like the Kiddush. We don't want the kids playing around with the cake.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I guess you could put him in the attic then. That's the only solution. Okay. So you find him next to a dough, and guess what? He's holding a piece of dough, right? The kids always want to lick. They always want to lick from the dough. That's exactly what he was doing. Rameir says the dough is tahar, and the rabbi says it's tummy. Why is it tummy? The rabbi says it's tummy. A kid, he messes around, and he probably messed around with it along with some bugs, and it's tummy. Ravina, but my time to Rameir. What's the reason of Rameir? So Gemara says, the majority of kids play with the bugs, the shrotzim, and there's a small minority that don't, right? The isa b'cheskes tara menace, and the dough has a cheskes tara. Yesterday it was tahara. There's no reason to presume necessarily that it changed. We have an event. We're not sure if it changed. So what do we say? Presume it stayed the same. You move the minority of kids that don't mess in the mud. So in other words, the kids certainly touched the dough. Now the question is, was the kid tummy? So now over here we have an interesting phenomenon, which is called the chazaka against the rove. Because the chazaka of the dough is, if we have a question whether or not it became tummy, what do we say? It did not become tummy. It stayed in its previous status. Now we have a majority that says, look, we know for certain this kid played around with the dough. And majority of kids are tummy because they mess around with shrotzim. So which one, who sort of wins the fight here? Fair question, right? You go by majority and say this kid is from the majority and therefore is a bug, he's playing with bugs and the dough is tummy, or do you say no? The chazaka of the dough says it's tar. Chazaka de mikara. Okay, so the opinion of Rameir, now we'll see this is a machlekes, it's a debate, but the opinion of Rameir is smeich miutu lechazaka isra leruba. You move the minority of kids. The chazaka says what happened? He was from the minority. So now this follows the famous Rameir's opinion, which we've seen at this point numerous times in Shas. Rameir is what we call chayesh lemiuta. Rameir concerns himself with the minority. There's 2 ways of looking at a minority where you have a majority. Is it that we completely ignore the minority as if it doesn't exist? Or do we say that the majority wins over the minority? But it's not like the minority isn't there. And over here, because there's a chazaka that supports the minority's opinion, so that weakens the argument of going by majority. Because the presumptive state tells you, go by minority. We're together? This is okay. This is one of the things you spend a lot of time with in yeshiva. Okay, Rabbanan say the minority is it's as if it isn't present. We don't give any significance to the minority. So what do we have? Ruba v'chazaka. We have a question of majority, the child being tamei against the chazaka, the presumptive state of the dough. What's the story? Ruba adif. Roiv is a stronger argument. Okay, this is a lot of income. Exactly why is this? Majority is better than presumption. Why is that? So discussion for a different day.
The minority should.
In other words, according to this opinion, we disrespect minority. Now we don't disrespect it; we ignore it. So if we ignore it, it's not present at all. Roiv, going by majority, is a much more logical idea than going by presumption. It's just a presumption. And the reason for this is very simple. Just wrap it up quickly. The reason is that majority is actually a very logical argument. So we call it birur. It's sort of set. It's sort of, if we have to presume something, we have to question what happened. Going by majority is a very logical thing to do. A presumption is just a presumption. Why should a presumption go against a logical argument? You have a question whether to follow a presumptive state, which there's no reason to say it didn't change. It's just a presumption. Against an argument that's logical and reasonable. Well, the logical and reasonable argument should carry the day. Okay. We call this a birur versus an haga. Okay, anyway. Omer Shlakish says, Mishumer Vaishya, Zui Shesarfan Allah es truma. This is an example where you burn truma. Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein zu chazaka shesarfan Allah truma. According to Rabbi Yochanan, however, the rabbis say it's tamei, and everybody agrees it's tamei. But what does it mean it's tamei? Does it mean it's tamei and you can go burn it as tamei? Or does it say no, Thailand? In other words, we treat it as a suffix. Perhaps it's tamei, perhaps it's not tamei. That second opinion is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, which is according to his own opinion. So you see here that Rabbi Yochanan is sort of cautious about burning truma because of, in this case, what we call it a chazaka presumption, but really it's really a majority. Okay, what's an example according to Rabbi Yochanan where we would burn truma? Tonight we learned. Isa b'teichabayas, you have a dough in the house. Ushrotzim utzfardim etapambay, and in the house we have frogs and bugs. Again, like I said, bugs here is the Hebrew is translation of the Hebrew word shrotzim, right? So a tzfardeya, a frog is not a sharetz. It's not whatever it is a sharetz, but it's not one of the shmeina shrotzim. So we have the bugs and the frogs, and they're fighting over the dough. We don't know which one. So they're not fighting. One of them has messed around with the dough. We don't know if it was the frogs, in which case the dough is tahar, or it was the shmeina shrotzim, the 8 bugs, and then it's tamei.
You wouldn't want to eat the dough if the frogs touch you.
Yeah. Sure. Well, if you had it, if you weren't as wealthy as we all are today, maybe you would. Right. And you remember, your floors weren't covered either. So we see there's marks in the dough. Somebody's been messing around with it. If the majority of the creatures are from these 8 types of bugs, tmeya, the dough is not good. If it's majority frogs, then it's permitted. Okay. Now, very interesting here. So in this case, Rabbi Yochanan says, if it's majority bugs, what do? We burn it. Hold on a second. If it's majority of kids messing around, that majority is not sufficient to burn truma. Right? A kid messes around with the dough. Majority of kids are tamei because they play around with bugs. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, not burning truma. Thailand, we're going to hang it. We don't know what to do. Maybe it's tamei, maybe it's tar. We're not going to burn it. When it's majority bugs in the house, and we know that something has been messing around with the dough, either it's the bugs or the frogs, majority bugs, we will burn truma. What's the difference? This is a difference that I pointed out a while back. So we call the difference between a ruba de isa kaman and a ruba de lesa kaman. What does that mean? There are majorities that are presumptive majorities versus majorities that are definitive majorities. So let's give an example. We have an animal, okay? The majority of animals are kosher. Is this a present majority or is this a presumptive majority? Eric, why don't you give a shot?
Well, I think Jules will shine down.
Is it a present majority or a presumptive majority?
Presumptive majority.
It's a presumptive majority. Why is it a presumptive majority? Why is it a presumptive majority? because we don't actually know whether the animal is kosher or not. As a matter of fact, we don't even know whether the majority of animals are kosher. Nobody's done a randomized control trial. Right? It doesn't have to be double blinded. Okay, fine. But nobody's done an RCT of the global animal population to determine that their lifespan is more than 12 months. It's obvious that we can presume that way because anyone with two eyes can look at the world and see that obviously most animals are not dying within 12 months. That's the definition of a treifa. So obviously the majority of animals are kosher. But the majority of animals aren't present to tell me that this animal is kosher. It's a presumption. The same thing is true with kids. Did somebody do a trial with kids and investigate how often they play with bugs? No, nobody's done that study. We have to know the frequency. We have to know a lot of questions to be able to answer the question. That is a presumptive majority that kids play with bugs. A presumptive majority, says Rabbi Yehudah, that's not sufficient to mess around with truma. However, we have a present majority. In other words, a good example of a present majority is a court, right? There are 9 members on the court, whatever, rabbinical court, 23 members, and 12 of them rule to convict. It's a present majority. So there's 11 of them that are saying he's innocent, and 12 of them that are saying he's guilty. So therefore, we execute him. That's a present majority. Same thing in this house. We don't know which bug. We don't know what exactly touched the dough, but we look around the house and we see 25 frogs and 101 Dalmatians, whatever, eight shrotzim, 8 types of bugs. So then we say that it's the 101 members of these 8 bugs.
In your illustration, we don't execute them.
So we're not executing, but we're saying that the tumah, because the roiv is a present roiv, because the majority members of the 8 bugs are present here, and there's a minority of the frogs. Therefore, that majority is a present majority. In that case, we would burn truma. That's the distinction that Rabbi Yehudah makes between the 2 types of majorities. Okay. Now we go back to Saita. Okay. 1 second here. Okay. Hainikav said to Rabbi Yehudah. We learned we have a brayso that supports the opinion of Rabbi Yehudah. Shnei dvarim ein behem da'as tishal, v'asam chacham k'ma sheyesh behem da'as tishal. There are 2 examples of things where you can't ask the question, but the rabbi said it's as if you could ask the question. What does this mean? The general rule here is that if we have a question whether or not something became tamei, okay, and there's somebody who knows the answer to the question. If there's someone who knows the answer, then in the public domain, it's tahar. In the private domain, it's tamei. If there's nobody who knows the answer, then even in the private domain, it's tamei. So, for example, there's 2 pieces, right? There's let's say meat in the house, and then there's a bug. We don't know if the bug touched the meat or not, and there's no reason to presume it's touched the bug, and there's no one present to know whether it touched the bug. It's tahar.
Okay.
So there are 2 scenarios where you can't ask the question. By the way, asking a kid is not being able to ask the question. You need to be able to ask an adult who's reliable.
But you said it could be tahar in private?
So generally speaking, the rule is suffix tumah. If you have a doubt of tumah in private it is tamei. In public, it's tahar. But that's even in a scenario, that's in a scenario where somebody might even know exactly whether or not there's tumah or not. If nobody knows whether it became tamei, then we treat it as tahar. And the reason for this is the sota herself. She knows whether or not she was adulterous. And that's the source of these claims. The sota is treated in private as an adulterer until she's verified not to be an adulterer by drinking the waters. Right? And she knows the answer to the question. And that's the source of this concept. Now, there are 2 scenarios where we can't ask the question, but we treat it as if we could. What's the example? This scenario of a kid touches the dough. We don't know if he touched the dough or not. We don't know how much of the dough he touched, or if he touched the bugs. But we say he's tamei anyway, as if he was able to be asked. And another one. Tinik hadamor. Okay, we saw tinik. What's the other one? Mahi. What is it? In the house, there are birds, there are chickens, and and there are liquid that's tamei. V'nimtza nikurim be'isa. We find peck marks in the dough. So what do we say? Toilim. We say it's a question. We can't eat it, but we can't burn it either. Okay, why not? Because we're concerned maybe the chicken drank from the tamei liquids, and while the liquid was still on his what do they call it, a beak? A beak?
Yeah.
The beak?
Yeah.
While the liquid was still on his beak, he was pecking at the dough. So he took tamei liquid and basically put it on the dough.
Ah.
Now, is anyone able to verify this question? No. Can't ask the chicken. Yeah, he's not going to be able to answer you. And yet we still treat it as a suffix and we say it's tamei. This is an exception to the rule. Apparently, this is obviously quite common to happen, that the chicken would drink the liquid and then peck at the dough. Okay, now just to clarify, we'll go through some more specifics about this instance, but that's basically the end of the Gemara. Now, just to address this chicken story, a few more details. Okay, which you might expect. These are sort of obvious differences, obvious details that would make a difference. Amar B'Shimon Levi, Lo yishano mashkim levanim, aval mashkim adumim emisa denakar made idea. Okay, obviously this tamei liquid was clear. It was a clear liquid. So if the chicken pecks, there's no way to know. But let's say the liquid was a red liquid. So presumably, if it would have pecked with a wet liquid, it would have turned red. Maybe yes. So Gemara says, I'm saying, bilatinu isa. Maybe sort of it pecked at the dough, and then it pecked in a neighboring spot, so it actually is red, but you haven't seen it because the red is inside the dough. It's not on the outside anymore. Because of the pecking of the chicken, it pushed the red stuff into the dough. I've heard this in the name of a big scholar and Rabbi Shimon Levi, and I've explained it as follows. The version is slightly different. It has to be clear enough that you could sort of mirror yourself in the reflection. However, if the liquid is dirty, it's a filthy liquid, so then you'd recognize that it wouldn't be able to be sort of pushed in. Maybe a speck of red could be pushed in, but if it's a dirty liquid, that dirt would have stayed around. It would have made the area of the dough dirty, and you would be able to tell it. Okay, and that concludes the very, very difficult portion of Asar Yachsin. So that part's done. Now we go on to another discussion, which is also quite pertinent and very interesting, but it's a very different discussion than the previous. The end of Parak Eimer, the beginning of Asar Yachsin, extensively deal with the question of Yuchsin, probably the most difficult sugya in Kiddushin, and certainly among the most difficult in Seder Nashim as well.
Is this supposed to make us feel better?
Yes. Now we go completely sideways and a different discussion completely, and then from here on we've basically finished that difficult component of Yuchsin. Okay. Now we talk about yichud, the prohibition for a man to seclude himself with a woman. Now let's just clarify: there are two prohibitions of yichud that are really separate. Is the man eligible to marry that specific woman? Is really the question. So there'd be yichud with, let's say, an erva or an eishesish. In other words, being secluded with a woman who's prohibited to you because either she's married or she's a close relative. And then there's yichud with a girl who's single, who technically speaking you are eligible to marry. If you wanted to, you could marry her. Yichud with a pnuya is an isur d'Rabbanan. Yichud with a woman who is prohibited to you is potentially an isur d'oraisa according to many Rishonim. Okay, and by the way, who was the one who created this prohibition? Dovid, after the story of Bathsheba, I believe. Okay, so learn all about it. A man should not seclude himself with two women. But a woman can seclude herself with two men. We'll get to the details in a moment, so no questions yet. But basically, the reason is because it is easier for a man to seduce two women, whereas two men, in other words, a man cannot be in seclusion with two women. Why? Because he can seduce both of them, and they won't tell on each other. Whereas two men are much more difficult to seduce. What about the men that are easy to seduce? We'll get to that in a moment. What about the men that wouldn't mind, engaging in such behavior in front of each other? Well, we'll get to it.
Oh, all
But generally speaking, if the men are regular, kosher, healthy men, then one woman can seclude herself with two men. Reb Shimon says, if his wife is with him, then he can seclude himself with two women, or two women. If I guess one of those women is his wife. Okay, whatever. A man is allowed to sleep in a room with other women if his wife is with him in that room. A man is allowed to have yichud with his mother or his daughter. The yashan imam b'kir basar, he's also allowed to sleep with them even if they're wearing a minimal amount of clothing. But as his daughters get older, or as he gets older, then they should be wearing clothing. What's this exception about of a mother or a daughter? Without getting into too much detail, basically the evil inclination for a mother or a daughter has been significantly mitigated since the time of the what was it? It would have been in the early Second Temple. That's when they, so to speak, slaughtered the desire for idolatry. And that obviously today there's very few people that have a desire for idolatry. It's certainly not a passion. Very few people are. It's very hard to even conceive people being passionate over sticks and stones. Yeah. I'm sure there are some people. There are people who are passionate about their mothers too. There's all sorts of perversions. But as a general rule, people will not be passionate over their mother or their daughter, and therefore there's no prohibition of yichud. My time. What's the reason a man can seclude himself with cannot seclude himself with two women? It's sort of easy to seduce two women. Their mind is lighter. What's the source? Where is there a potential hint to the concept of yichud? Shenemar, as the verse states. Okay, this verse is talking about worshiping. It's talking about idolatry. It's not talking about adultery or incest, for that matter. It isn't a sexual context, even though the word seduction is used. If your brother, the son of your mother, will seduce you. 1 second. Only the brother of your mother is going to seduce you, like no other brother. If it's your mother from your mother and your father, full brother or half brother from your father, he's not going to seduce you. Only a brother from your mother will seduce you. If he ben amasis, ben av animasis, is that the one who's going to seduce you to idolatry? The verse is telling you ben misyachanim imay v'osel misyachanim kol raya shebetorah. That this is sort of homiletically being interpreted that a son can seclude himself with his mother, but not with any other erfa. That's sort of a remes. The Gemara says Pasha Dikra b'maiksiv. What's the simple version of what's a simple understanding? In other words, without the homiletics, why indeed does the Torah specifically pick on a half brother from the mother's side, a maternal half brother? Mm-hmm. Why doesn't what's unique about a maternal half brother that would have him seduce you to idolatry? So the Gemara says, ben av the son ilay va'ayetz le etzes rois. Skip the joke. Okay. There's much more competition on a paternal half brother. Effectively, they compete over the inheritance. And sort of the prestige. If the father, had a prestigious position. Alafilu ben aim, if you even a paternal brother where there's much less competition, maybe you might listen to him. Kamashmallah. That's why the Torah picks on him as an example of someone who will seduce you, because a person's always suspicious on the ideas of his paternal half brother, much more than his maternal half brother. Kamashmallah. Okay, Neimas isn't like Abishal. Let's say our Mishnah is not like Abishal. The Tanya we learned. Okay, basically, if you have this is either a stillborn or a neonate fatality. The child dies before 30 days, or was a stillborn. He has to be buried before 30 days. If he's buried, he does not necessarily require all the strict laws of Kever Yisrael. Now, I'm sure Donna can give us the specific details of what we do today, although we don't have time for it now. But feel free to leave a message and let us know what exactly you do if the child is less than 30 days old or a stillborn. Okay, so he goes out in a basket. There's no full tachrichim here. And he's buried with one woman, the mother presumably, and two men. That's because the burial places were out of the city. These would have been private places because nobody was there, and therefore it was necessary to make sure there wasn't seclusion. But not with one man and two women. Abishal says even one man and two women is also not called seclusion. So it seems that Abishal disagrees with our Mishnah. So Gemara says no. I feel tame Abishal. Even our Mishnah could still be with Abishal. Abishal makes an exception for a scenario of an infant mortality, a neonate mortality. Why is that? B'shas Anina's Tavar Yitzrei, at the time where he's an Einen, he's in pain. She's in pain over the suffering because she lost her child. The Tavar Yitzrei, it sort of breaks her desire, and there isn't anything to be concerned about one man and two women. Rabbanan Savri like Rabbi Yitzchak. The rabbis go with the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak, Mayis Ein Adam Chai Gever Al Chatov. The pain of a person is alive. Gever Al Chatov. Afilu b'shas nina shel Adam Yitzrim Misgaberov. Even in the time where a person is in pain, he still has a strong desire. This is talking about somebody who's complaining about God, and this is the interpretation of the verse. Ma Yisram al midaisav. Why should a person complain about God's actions? Has he been strong to make sure he hasn't sinned? Obviously, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Everyone's sinned. So he should be happy with the life that we have given him, that God has given him. And the rabbis apparently knew of a story where a woman was indeed broken over her neonate's mortality, and didn't make a difference. Apparently, she was seduced and to lie with some stranger. Okay. Aval isha achas. One woman with two men is permitted. Amar Rabbi Yehudah Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehudah says in the name of Rav, Lo yishanu al b'ksherim. This is only true with kosher men. Aval b'prutzim. But if the guy is, let's say of questionable character, they used to call these things a playboy, not going to work. Afilu be'asar nami, like even 10 people isn't enough. Ma'isa, there's a story of Vaitzu asar mita, where 10 people sort of 10 of these playboys seduced one woman, and they sort of carried her out of town, and did what they did in the forests. Amr Rav Yosef says, Teda de mechabre be'asara v'ganvi kshura v'loy mechsvi me'adadi. I have proof of this. Why? Because you have 10 thieves. They get together and they steal. But they're not embarrassed of each other. And the same is true of people, of 10 playboys, so to speak. Okay. Let's try to bring a proof to this. This is where the sota is being brought from her city to Jerusalem to be investigated. Okay. So it's the father, the husband, and the woman are going, and also we give them two scholars, Shema Yavel Abaderach, to make sure that the husband isn't intimate with his wife before the waters have checked her, because if he has, the waters won't check her. Because once there's a suspicion of adultery, the husband cannot lie with her until that suspicion is verified through those waters. Okay, it specifically has to be scholars. In Shida Alma, because regular people, i.e., somebody who's potentially questionable character, the prominent eligible bachelor, probably not a good idea to have him be in the escort. So Gemara says no, not necessarily. That's not necessarily the reason why you need scholars. They will be able to warn him, and tell him to basically stay away from her until she's drinking from these waters. Okay, Amar Rav Yehudah Amar Rav. Rav Yehudah says in the name of Rav, Lo yishanu el be'ir, aber b'derech ad sheyu shloisha. Okay, when is the rule 2 men for 1 woman prevents seclusion? This is true in a city, but on a journey you need a 3rd man. Why? Even if they're kosher men. Why is this? Maybe one of them will need to relieve himself. When he goes off to the sides in the trees, the other guy is in seclusion with this woman. Maybe there's support for this. So over here you have three people, two scholars plus the husband, right? And the reason for that is because along the journey, perhaps one of them will need to go to the bathroom, and then you'll have this way you'll have two people and not one person together with the woman in question. So Gemara says, not exactly support. It could be the reason why there's two scholars is that they should serve as witnesses. If the husband is intimate with his wife, they'll be able to testify so that she does not have to drink the waters. Rav and Rabbi Yehudah were traveling on the road. There was this woman that was walking next to them, and this obviously was in a very deserted area, very empty place. Amrle Rav Rav Yehudah. So Rav says to Rav Yehudah, he was concerned about a potential for seclusion. Dal Karach, start walking faster. Mekame Gehenim, from the potential to be in Gehenim, i.e., to be in a situation of seclusion. Because if we're walking sort of at the same pace with her, and one of us needs to relieve himself, then there will be the other one of us will be in seclusion with her. Amrle Marud Amr B'Shem Shaper Dami. So Rav Yehudah says to him, 1 second, but there's two of us, so it's not a problem for Yichud. Amrle. So and two should be sufficient. 1 second. So in other words, if there's two people, there's no seclusion. So even if she comes, in other words, evidently he wasn't concerned. I guess this was sort of a busier street, and he wasn't so concerned about seclusion when one of them would have to relieve himself. But in general, the rule is 2 men with 1 woman. So what's the problem? You have 2 men here. Who said that we are kosher? Maybe we're also questionable characters. So who is kosher? Like the famous Rav Chanina Bar Papi and his friends. Okay, stop here.
Takes so long.
What's that?
If he was urinating, that wouldn't take very long.
Yeah, so it could be. It's interesting. The other one, you're probably right. It probably refers to defecating, but
Right.
but it's the Gemara. Gemara actually uses urinating as examples. That's why I said urinating is example. The Gemara says I didn't